Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 32, the Day Zero podcast. First Power of Two episode. Haven't had one of those in a little while. But yeah, we'll just jump right into it. First, we'll get into some election news. So always fun to start off with some little bit political stuff,
Yeah, not quite news or anything. This is, Bug Crowd put it out, but
more of an advisory, I guess.
Yeah, it's just a post. I figured we'd kind of echo the same thing here. And essentially, one of their kind of initial points here, still just so the title here is Election Security 2020. Don't let disinformation undermine your right to vote. Effectively, you can guess from the name, talking about disinformation. Saw plenty of it during the 2016 election. We're starting to see it now, even through like the primaries and all of that. And for what it's worth, Spectre and I are both Canadians, so we don't really have a horse in.
We don't have a dog in the fight, no.
Yeah, I was going to say horse in the race, but dog in the fight works too. That's it. They do make kind of the one point here, a tweet of a voting machine that looks like it's infected by ransomware could be effective at deterring voter turnout and confidence as the real deal. Honestly, I feel like I can't think of the exact case, but I feel like we've actually seen this where somebody took a picture of a USB stick plugged into a voting machine. It just made like the tweet like, what's this or something. And of course, everybody blew that up as, it's clearly hacking or whatever. And it's terribly easy for somebody just come in, do that, take a picture and like completely benign. But you take the right picture, you frame it the right way, and everybody, just runs with it.
Yeah, part of the problem is anything where there's like political motivation, it's easy to automatically take things at face value and kind of run with them if they support your idea. So that's why it's like the disinformation campaigns on that are so effective.
Yeah, and at the same time, people like to jump on hating electronic voting. Anything that brings electronics into voting is automatically bad. Everybody hates it. And I've definitely kind of stepped up on the soapbox a couple times about that because I do want to see technology improve around voting. Mm-hmm. And I'm also for having a proper process, not just immediately like, oh yeah, here's the presidential election. Let's, try this idea out. Like,
let's just try it out willy-nilly. It'll work.
Yeah, like I definitely think the process needs to be there. Similar to crypto, needs to stand the test of time before we start using it on anything that actually matters. But I do want to see progress made in terms of technology rather than just staying with paper ballots and, hand counting. That said, I'm really just echoing kind of the point of this bug crowd topic. Take that for what you will. Oh, go ahead.
I think what makes this interesting is we have talked a lot about election hacking in the past, and obviously, like you said, it's going to be a big topic this year. I think it's kind of interesting to take that other side of the coin. I remember you were saying, this is kind of interesting in that idea of faking a compromise and like the social engineering aspect. And one parallel to that I kind of thought of when I was reading through this was a pretty long time ago now. I can't remember exactly which episode, but I remember we were talking about phishing with Auntie, and we were talking about using disinformation in that to help with social engineering. So like, phishing using passwords from password dumps to try to force people to follow links and stuff like that. I forget what the campaign was, but I like that was one parallel I was kind of drawing from that. In the same vein of faking a compromise in a way to try to advance a social engineering goal. It's kind of the opposite of security. It's basically the opposite of security through disinformation. It's insecurity through disinformation.
Yeah, well, just in the Democratic primaries, actually, I want to say it was the Iowa primary. Is it Iowa does the caucus, I think, actually.
Yeah, it was the Iowa caucus.
Yeah, the Iowa caucus and the Iowa caucus application. And apparently, there's like SQL injection in the application and a bunch of other stuff. And there very well may have been, but I never saw much evidence of there actually being that issue, but I saw it repeated a lot. The only evidence I actually did see was a picture of a SQL error, which, of course, is an issue, but the error itself didn't have any indication that you could break out of the inputs. It was basically just, this query didn't match anything error image. Like I said, there may have been other images that proved more or that could do more. But basically, like, the evidence wasn't there, but a lot of people were just saying, well, it's, clearly just completely insecure. Maybe it was. I mean, having just a straight up SQL errors visible is a bad sign. But the evidence of an actual compromise just wasn't there either.
Yeah, that's a good example. But I mean, yeah, it just kind of reinforces that point of don't take things at face value. I will make a slight thing that I kind of disagree with the article about. They say to get information from legitimate media outlets. I think over the past little while we've been seeing that even they have sometimes been doing the same thing, taking things at face value and not verifying them. I would say what would probably be a better statement would be to get information directly from the election officials at the venue. You know what I mean? It's a bit less convenient, but I think it's a lot more likely to be accurate. So I did want to say I do disagree a little bit with that conclusion.
Yeah. Well, it also mentions and verified social handles, which we've kind of seen Twitter. Yeah, they verified. I guess there was a teenager that created an account pretending to be one of the 2020 Democratic candidates, and they got verified by Twitter.
I didn't hear about that actually, but yeah, the verification process on Twitter is kind of a joke. You can't really put any stock in that. So yeah. Just want to kind of disagree a little bit with the article. But that being said, we can move on to Pwn2Own. So Pwn2Own announced they're going to allow remote participation in Pwn2Own Vancouver. We like covering Pwn2Own on the show, and it's a cool event. But a lot of events internationally have been getting canceled because of coronavirus, or COVID-19 is the other common term for it now, which I think is understandable. You want to stop the spread where you can. When you have people coming through from all different kinds of countries to one area, it's a lot easier to spread it to other countries, and it's just kind of a mess. So in kind of respect to that, they're actually changing the rules of Pwn2Own this year. A key rule they're going to change is that contestants previously needed to be present physically at the venue to participate. And they're actually making an exception this year. They're making it so that you can participate remotely, basically. And that's what this article is about. And basically how it'll work is to participate. The person participating will be in communication with somebody from ZDI staff, and then the staff member will attempt to run the exploit chain. And if they want, the contestants can, request to work with the staff member in real time through phone or video chat or anything like that.
However, something they can't do is decide to, or have the exploit be changed. Yeah. The developer can monitor the attempt in real time with a phone or video call, but the exploit or changes to the exploit will not be possible. So you're definitely at a disadvantage there. If you want to make some minor changes, even, that won't be something you can do.
Yeah, it's fairly common because a lot of vendors like to push out changes to their software like the day before Pwn2Own just to screw with the contestants. So it is, from what I understand, I haven't been to Pwn2Own, but from what I understand, it is a fairly common occurrence to need to make some changes to your exploits, especially in some of the more complex targets like browsers and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, that is a major consideration if you are looking to participate remotely.
I suppose, it is a better compromise than just canceling the event altogether.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Especially if you
I'd say overall it's a net benefit to people who still want to participate but don't want to run that risk of not wanting to go there because of the risk of catching COVID. But I mean, yeah, I think overall it's a net benefit, I think. One thing I did find interesting, though, is they didn't seem to mention if this rule is going to be carried forward or if it was just like a one-time thing because of the outbreak.
Well, so they do mention that, this is because of the concerns around the coronavirus. Yeah. So I'm going to assume, or I would at least make the assumption that we can't expect it to be there in the future. If it was, or if we could, then they would probably mention that.
That's what I was thinking.
Or we'll find out next time. Maybe it's like, well, that actually worked out pretty well. Let's offer that option again. I can't imagine they're expecting it to be a repeating thing. I mean, it's in response to a particular pandemic.
Yeah. That being said, I do kind of like that idea of it being like a trial run, because to be perfectly honest, I'm not entirely certain why that rule is even there in the first place, that they need to be physically present. I mean, I know that the vendors of the software and whatnot are on site, which is obviously a benefit for them, so they can talk directly with the researcher on location to try to fix the issue, or at least understand the issue.
Well, there's that.
But
it's a bit of it comes down to just kind of equality between the teams. Each team gets access to it for this long. They all get the same level of access. Nobody's advantage or disadvantage based on internet. If something cuts out, like there's a lot of things I think people can complain about. And, at this level, I would imagine that just be there in person as an equalizer.
Okay. Yeah, it's a good point that I hadn't really thought of. But yeah, at least for the next event, there's remote participation. So, if you're interested in that, maybe that'll kind of push you into participating in it where you otherwise wouldn't have. But yeah, we can move on to Let's Encrypt. So Let's Encrypt. Oh man, they had some issues.
One issue, one bug.
Yeah, one bug
that really matters.
Issue.
Yeah.
So they're announcing that they're going to have to revoke a bunch of SSL certificates. Over 1 million, I think, was the stat I saw being thrown around. And it was basically due to
actually over 3 million. So 1 million are still not revoked. And that they won't actually be revoking, and then about 1 million unique, and then about another 1 million were duplicates. So the domain, certificates that share domains. So your www dot and your just domain could be on the same certificate. Those are being counted as different domains, but there's about 1 million that actually, I guess right here on the report you've got 3,048,289 certificates that were affected. 1.7 million have been replaced and revoked, and there's still more than 1 million whose status is either unknown or not replaced. And about 1 million were duplicates.
Clear. That's what I was talking about, was that, outlying 1 million. I think the 1.7 million were kind of fixed automatically. They didn't really need, the people managing the domain to actually step in. They kind of handled it automatically, from what I could deduce. But those,
they said that
are going to have to be, handled by the.
Those 1 million, they're actually not revoking them. You'll notice here, one of their updates there. It's we believe it's likely that more than 1 million certificates will not be replaced before the compliance deadline. Rather than potentially break so many sites and cause concern for their visitors, we have determined that it's in the best interest of the health of the internet for us not to revoke those certificates by the deadline. And that comes down, they explain that they only offer certificates at 90-day lifetimes. So the potentially affected certificates that they don't revoke are still going to kind of leave the ecosystem quickly, compared to 3-year certificates or even just 1-year certificates.
Yeah. So they do mention that, most of the sites that were affected were sites that often renew their certificates, on monthly basis or whatever like that.
Yeah, well, I think their default code, if you follow the certbot's defaults, I think it has a checking every 2 weeks to do a renewal.
Oh, really? That I don't.
Yeah, it's on the 15th and the 30th of every month, or something, or 15th and 28th, or something. It's something like that. Twice a month, it's supposed to check.
Yeah. So just addressing a question from chat, what was the actual issue? I'll get into that now. It basically seems to be in their certificate authority software called Boulder. And basically, when a certificate request contained domain names that needed rechecking, because the domains need to be validated 8 hours. The domain was validated 8 hours or more before issuance. They need to be revalidated.
Let me step in. Window. Actually, it's not quite with the domains just needing to be revalidated. Specifically, those that have CAA DNS entries, which are the certificate authority checking. at least some of that was when you had multiple domains that needed the CAA rechecking, then Boulder would pick one, and rather than say you had n domains that need to be checked, Boulder would pick one of them and check it n times.
Yeah.
So it sounds like a straightforward, like I haven't seen the code, but just one of those logic issues, just using the wrong variable and iterator type thing.
So I actually did look at the code. I managed to dig a little bit deeper and find it, and I'll actually bring it up on the stream because I thought it was kind of interesting. You were very close in your guesstimate. Let me just bring it up here. They have a snippet of the Golang code that contained the bug. Basically, we'll scroll down here to it. They iterate through the loop, and they make a copy for the key in the map, but they don't make a copy for the value. So it's basically they took a reference to a loop iterator variable without copying it. Did it not scroll to it on the screen? Oh, I guess it's not going through. But
no,
yeah,
it didn't scroll. I was trying to find it.
But yeah, you have it open right there. So yeah, you can see they make a copy of K, but of V they just reference directly. So instead of doing what it's intended, it does exactly what you said, where it just checks the same domain n times instead of checking n domains. So one thing that was cool that they did was they made an online tool to check if your domain is affected. It's checkhost.unboundtest.com. So it's worth checking. I checked some of the domains we have to make sure. But yeah, most of the domains affected were automatically fixed. The initial bug was actually introduced back in 2019 in July 25th, I think. But what was interesting was the bug was reported in 2019 as well, near the end of August, but they initially thought it was a less serious bug in the error handling. I found this out when I was looking through some of the Bugzilla reports and stuff like that. But later on, it was discovered that it was a far more serious issue, and that's when they immediately stopped issuing certs and patched it. But it took a long time to get to that point.
I found it really interesting that with some of their one of the issues that they discovered was that 445 certificates that they had issued had CAA records that forbid issuance by Let's Encrypt. So these had the registration saying like, hey, Let's Encrypt is not allowed. Well, I mean, generally speaking, you're using that to say this, to specify which certificate authority can provide it. But effectively, they all were saying Let's Encrypt isn't allowed to submit us or create certificates for us, and yet Let's Encrypt still did. Granted, that's only 445. And yeah, out of chat, so it's not, Belika mentioned here, so it's not as big of an issue as it sounds by the numbers. And I'd really say, just because of the scale of Let's Encrypt, it just sounds absolutely terrible. And I mean, it is, but they're still at least validating at least one of the domains is in there. You've already kind of gone through some of the process. You have like a cert in Let's Encrypt, and there's a chance that something may have changed that resulted in Let's Encrypt no longer, being the authority for that domain.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that pretty much covers the Let's Encrypt stuff. I don't know if you have anything more to add on that, but I think, that pretty much covers it.
Question, actually, since you looked at the code there a bit, was it checking just the first domain?
Yeah.
It was just the first one?
Yeah, it was checking the first domain that it found in the map, and then it was just checking that over and over again, basically.
Okay, yeah, that seems like what would usually happen with that sort of logic error, but I was basing a lot of my notes off of just what Let's Encrypt had said in one of their updates, which it just said that it selected a domain and checked it n times. It wasn't clear that it was always like the first one, which
well, I think part of that is, technically speaking, in Golang, maps, the order of maps are not guaranteed. Yeah, they're unordered, so it might not be the first domain you specify, but it's the first one in the map. Fair enough. So that's probably why they said that. But yeah, we'll get into FuzzBench, which is our weekly fuzzing topic provided by Google.
It's Google has definitely kind of pushed fuzzing further, with syscaller. And I'm definitely glad to see this. This is something we've complained about before. We've talked about certain fuzzers just having a weird choice of benchmarks when they would try and prove that their fuzzer works. And sometimes I'm sure that just has to do with trying to make their fuzzer look better by choosing software that had better performance. Yeah, by cherry picking. So what Google's put out here is FuzzBench, which is benchmarks for fuzzers, essentially. The other thing is that it offers some free compute time for fuzzers that integrate with them. You have to apply, but the gist of this is it's a free service to evaluate fuzzers. And I'm actually going to pull up kind of one of these sample reports.
While you do that, I will just say that is actually one thing they mentioned directly as kind of their catalyst for wanting to do it, was saying that they were looking at, some of the papers and stuff for a lot of the newer fuzzing techniques, and they were saying they noticed a lot of the times they come up short when it comes to showing those results. So, that is what we said, but I think it's worth noting that that's actually the main drive behind providing that, opening up that service.
Yeah, and it completely makes sense for what Google's been trying to do, too, in terms of how they push fuzzing and all of that. It's an automated means to find a lot of bugs. Exploitable or not, maybe not, but to find a lot of issues. And so I pulled up the report here. But I mean, basically, this just runs, whatever fuzzer. You have to integrate it. Like I said, you integrate it with FuzzBench, and then you're able to basically apply, like if you've got a new fuzzer, integrate, apply, and then you get this 24 hours of testing where it runs the fuzzer against several applications. They have this bloaty fuzz target, which I'm assuming is their own just example program. But they run it against things that you'd be familiar with too. SQLite 3, PHP, like the language parser, libping, libpcap, libjpeg.
Real world targets.
Yeah, the curls in there. Vorbis, woff, so that's like your fonts, zlib. Basically a lot of, yeah, as you said. Real world targets, yeah. Free type shows shows like coverage reached and by several fuzzers. So it'll compare whatever fuzzer you're submitting along with several others. This is definitely a net positive. One, it's expensive to kind of just run this on your own, so they're offering this free of charge for fuzzers.
Yeah, I think they said trying to get like similar coverage, you would need to run it on basically like 1,000 CPUs over a 24-hour period. So.
Yeah, it's definitely pricey, especially when you're talking about research teams or whatever that, probably don't have a lot of backing and are just kind of exploring an idea.
Yeah. But sorry, I kind of cut you off there. You can continue there.
No, I mean, that was fine. I was just more or less done already, actually. That said, you can also run this yourself. You don't have to use, use their compute time, like do that application. You can run this yourself. They show how to set it up. Obviously, it's using Google Cloud Services. They're going to make some money off you doing that, but you can do all of it yourself too. If you have that super secret fuzzer you don't want people to know about and don't want Google getting their hands on.
So one thing that's noteworthy is some of the fuzzers that they've already integrated with and you can compare with are very notable. They have like libfuzzer in there, AFL. These are very high profile fuzzers. And so this article is basically putting out like a call for fuzzers, kind of, trying to get people to integrate their fuzzers and techniques to improve fuzzing as a whole. Overall, I think it's a cool idea, and it does obviously solve an issue that we've seen, even like, just in topics we've covered in this show. There is some caveats though. Even though, like you said, you can run it yourself, I think that idea that it has to leverage Google Cloud Services is going to be kind of a deal breaker for some people. Part of the reason I mentioned that is a friend was actually looking into ClusterFuzz, which is a Google fuzzing like setup, and that also needs Google services. And there's kind of a bit of a conflict of interest there if you're doing bounties for Google stuff and you're storing 0 days on the Google Cloud. I'm not necessarily saying Google would steal your 0 days, but the possibility is there, and I think people will be wary of that. So I think that's worth keeping in mind, that maybe some of the cutting edge fuzzers that are secret might not use this, honestly.
Well, I mean, if they're secret, they're not going to use it, frankly.
Yeah.
I mean,
So
it is
there
like
is that limitation.
I don't think Google is going to be spying on people like that. But at the same time, you know, when you're concerned about that, you're also concerned nation state actors. So Google may not, you know, systematically be spying on it, but is there the potential for an insider attack? Yes.
Yeah.
That's it. I think for most people, that isn't really the concern. That isn't the level that you're operating at. You know, especially people publishing fuzzers, like research papers on fuzzers, as we've talked about before.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, this is definitely a great service. You know, it's just helping expand the knowledge base.
I do have a bit of a question. Given that it's gotten some adoption and some credibility already with, you know, AFL and whatnot being integrated with it.
Well, so Google themselves did that integration. So,
yeah,
I mean, you can't really say adoption because, you know, they've kidnapped
it.
Is
integrated with it. Like,
yes.
You know what I mean? It's still there. Yeah. The results are still there. And along with the fact that it's being supported by Google, do you think this will actually start seeing this being used in future white papers eventually? Maybe, you know, in like within a few months or within a year or so?
Oh, yeah, I think definitely. I mean, just because it is free, it doesn't look too difficult to actually integrate with it. I took just a brief look.
I think.
I can't see a good reason why new fuzzer research wouldn't take this into account.
Harder to cherry pick. So
that's true.
It might make the fuzzer look worse than it actually is.
They might use it and not report on the results in their paper.
Yeah, I mean, that would be actually interesting. That could be another thing that this might provide that I hadn't actually considered before, is it might actually help to throw up red flags on papers that don't use it. Because like you were saying, there's not much of a reason not to use it. It's kind of a net benefit. So if your paper isn't using it, it's going to make me question a bit of the results of
there can
why.
be reasons not to use it. So we talked about, there's that it was like a power analysis fuzzer, if I recall correctly. It was looking for like the power analysis side channels, fuzzing for that.
Yeah, I remember.
Or fuzzing for side channels. So something like that maybe, you know, doesn't really matter as much with these applications that they've chosen. They'd want to run that against some crypto algorithms. I mean, we had complained about their choice of benchmarks there, and I would argue that this maybe wouldn't be a good set of benchmarks for that either.
That's a fair point.
So there are reasons why you wouldn't, but in general, when we're just talking about those things, trying to find, you know, trying to find those general software issues. Yeah, I think especially if we do see some adoption. I mean, if we just never see anybody using this again, then okay, you know, if papers don't have it, it's not much of a red flag. But yeah, if we see the adoption, I would have to say that it would be a red flag if somebody suddenly didn't include it and should have.
Yeah. So overall, I think this will be good for research papers, but it probably won't be used by, you know, zero-day researchers.
And I will just really quickly mention, thank you, Mr. Gate, for the 100 bits.
Yeah, that's a good show. So we'll get into some exploits. Our first topic is the one that probably took off the most in the media. It's the Intel
this or the
root of
next
trust.
one. Both of these, at least I saw a lot about, but yeah.
Okay. So yeah, this first one is the Intel root of trust, loss of trust article. You've probably seen it. It talks about an issue in the Intel Converged Security and Management Engine, CSME. Now, we have some reservations on this. I think we kind of agree that this was blown out of proportion a little bit. I think we'll get into that a little bit later. But let's talk about the issue first. CSME, for people who don't know, it's basically an engine that handles secure storage of keys for cryptography and whatnot. It's used for a lot of like DRM based things, but also non-DRM based. Like it's used for verifying other firmware at later stages in the boot process. It's used for trusted platform module.
Yeah, it's used trusted platform modules where the keys are stored. CSME is a little bit wider than that because that's also like your management engine. So that's we've talked about other issues with management engine before, being able to basically control the entire computer by compromising the management engine, and it's completely out of band. So like you've got a motherboard with an Intel chip. As long as there's power to the chip, not if the computer's on, but just there's power to the chip, you can exploit the management engine and then access the hard drive, access everything else that's attached to the motherboard. So like the management engine, CSME it's supposed to be a more secure area, of course, but specifically TPM is where the keys were being stored. That's instead of having the TPM off on its own chip, they just kind of included it in there, but management engine is a little bit bigger than just that.
Yeah. But what makes it kind of important is that it's basically the top of the chain of trust. Everything that comes after it is kind of verified by that.
Yeah, it's root of trust.
Yeah. So the issue is essentially that the firmware in the boot ROM for CSME initializes the page tables and starts page translation. But the IOMMU, which is the input-output memory management unit, isn't actually started until later. And the reason that that's an issue is you shouldn't normally be able to do direct memory access writes to the static RAM, but that rule is actually enforced by the IOMMU. So between that window, before IOMMU is actually initialized, you can write directly to SRAM through DMA. So obviously you do need physical access to pull off this attack. It's not something you can pull off remotely.
Yeah, read and write, I believe.
Yeah. But yeah, if the user can force CSME to reset, they can force the MMU parameters to reset. They can modify those system tables for the pages for CSME. The problem here is that this is actually an old vulnerability. It's from 2019, CVE 2019-0090. So this is over a year old, because I think that CVE was actually reported in like January of 2019. And the article authors state that the patch for that CVE just tries to mitigate one potential attack vector. They say specifically through the integrated sensors hub, and that there potentially could be others. But like, here's the issue with that. Boot ROM bugs can't really be patched easily because it's an on-die circuit. You can't just hot patch the boot ROM. You can try to do patches to do like workarounds to try to prevent vectors to access it, which is what they did with that patch. But, they're kind of limited in what they can do. And the article writers even say it themselves, Intel understands they cannot fix the vulnerability, so they were trying to block all exploitation vectors. We think there may be more. Okay. I don't think that really says too much. They say some may require local access, others need physical. It seems like they're not even quite sure what other ways there could be to exploit it. They just think there could be some. It's kind of weird.
Well, that's what they're doing. They're pointing out that, hey, the mitigation that's in place isn't sufficient. But it was already known that basically nothing they did was going to be sufficient. They're just kind of giving a concrete example of, there you go.
Yeah. Another thing of note is they point out that code execution doesn't jeopardize the root key, because they say it's stored in basically programmable read-only memory, and that's protected by fuses, and it's encrypted. So they state you need to extract the hardware key that was used to encrypt the chipset key. They say it's a static key across like a generation of chipsets, which isn't great, but like that's still a big caveat that you have to do that.
Yeah, so you are you're not able to get that key out because that key itself is encrypted, and so you're able to pull out the key, but you can't decrypt the key to actually know the value. But because of your early access, you can, however, get the integrity control value key, which will allow, that's kind of where you're able to bypass the authenticity checks. Mm-hmm. So there are still things you can do with this besides just the one key that they talk about. Like, that one key would be the game over, but there are still attacks that are made viable because of this.
Yeah. Now, a lot of the discussion I saw around the topic, people were actually seemed to be happy about the issue. It seems not too many people took into account the fact that it was an old vulnerability. But the big discussion was around trusted computing in the context of DRM, and how these vulnerabilities being unpatchable is basically a win for the community, bring down ARM. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that angle. I'm not a huge DRM fan, but trusted computing isn't only used for DRM. That was just kind of one of the early pushes for it, was for that. But I think trying to tar trusted computing as bad just because it's used for DRM is a little bit disingenuous, because it does have other legitimate uses. So I don't know if I really necessarily agree with some of the takes that I saw about it. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Z.
I mean, I'm not entirely even against DRM. So I guess to be a little bit more specific about that, when it comes to DRM, it's a mixed bag. With DRM, we're at least having people willing to start making things available on systems, making it at least somewhat more convenient to use. Would I prefer a world without DRM? Absolutely. Because, I mean, DRM just generally is very anti-consumer, but at the same time, would I rather a world where everything was like locked behind some proprietary system that you had to go and buy and use so they could lock it down, versus having some mechanism for it on most machines that just makes it more convenient to use? I'd have to go for the convenience aspect.
Yeah, that's a good point as well, and I'd probably agree with you on that. Yeah, so yeah, some of the community takes, it seems like people kind of just took the headline and ran with it. Overall, I don't think the article is bad. I do want to say that. I think
it felt very like it was a PR move, though. And I will mention, Belika mentions malware in chat, and I will say that's another thing. I mean, being able to bypass some of the authenticity checks, that is a place where you can potentially start getting malware. Now, I haven't heard about that being done in the wild or anything, but I mean, there's the potential for any such exploits to also be used to kind of get in pretty deep into your system.
Yeah. But yeah, I don't think the article is bad. I do think they tried to make it seem like more of a big deal than it is and try to plate it up a bit, like you were saying, with a bit of a PR move. At the same time, I think it is on the readers as well to read some of the caveats they point out, which they should be credited for, actually. They do point out some of those caveats, about not being able to get the root key.
I think their reporting here is fair. I was going to say fairly fair. It's fair. They make mention of the caveats there. It is a lot. Like I said, I do feel like there is the PR aspect to it. They put this out not so much because it was this great news, but just as another chance to kind of get their name out there. But yeah, definitely still on the readers, because it's not like they're wrong about anything they've said here, but people understanding the impacts of it have been.
Yeah, I will say we probably will be seeing this again in the near future, because they do say there's going to be a white paper published soon for the issue. So, we probably will cover that again if that does come to pass. I imagine there's probably no reason it wouldn't. They're probably just holding off to give, I don't know. I'm actually not sure why they didn't just publish the white paper with this, actually, more that I think about it. But yeah, we may see the white paper soon.
It might,
so that's worth keeping in mind.
Might still just be a work in progress. I mean, so I don't know what the history of positive technologies is. Obviously, they seem to have a fairly lengthy blog. But I don't know, we've seen them a couple times in the last several episodes, so it seems like maybe they're doing more of a push to get into the news or something. So by splitting it up, they're getting onto more news cycles, or maybe there's a completely benign reason for it. I don't want to assert any sort of malice or anything like that here.
Yeah. So we've had our topic that kind of takes a shot at Intel, so it's only fair that I guess we go to AMD as well. So we'll move into a paper on AMD exploring the security implications of AMD's cache weight predictors. So Z, I'll let you take this one away, just because I didn't manage to look into this one too much. So
yeah, and I'm not necessarily going to dive too deep into this one, but essentially what they're looking at here is kind of another side channel for exfiltrating information, but this time, whereas we've seen several kind of looking at the Intel systems, this is trying to focus in on AMD. There are some issues with it that I'll get into, but they propose two kind of new attacks. So before I jump into that, I'll mention the L1D cache predictor. effectively, the way this works is the cache will be divided into. So first of all, where the name comes from, cache is being divided into sets and ways. So if you're not familiar with that terminology, like the way kind of has a meaning in here related to the caches. But it creates this micro tag on the virtual address. So if you're putting basically everything you read off RAM goes into the level 1 cache. And then the CPU actually reads off the cache. So when you look up for a memory address, it's going to look like, hey, do I have this in cache already, or do I need to fetch it? So this micro tag is an undocumented hash that also kind of adds a little bit of a optimization in terms of how they're going to look up and see if any memory address is already in the cache. And by doing that, this tag basically determines which way the memory would be in. So instead of needing to check all of the ways, so I want to say like a lot of caches might be like a 4-way cache. Instead of needing to check all 4 entries in each cache set, they can just check the one way, see is it correct. So basically they're cutting down the number of comparisons that are needed. Kind of makes sense. That's the optimization that they had to do some reverse engineering of that. So that's kind of why it matters here. And what they've found here is you can kind of guess actually where this goes. With collide and probe is one of the attacks. They've basically come up with monitoring another process attempt to access by creating hash collisions. This is based around a lot of. Let me see if I can find where it is in here, but they propose 2 attacks taking advantage of this predictor. One being that collide and probe, where you collide with a particular memory address and then see if the other process actually accessed that based on the time it takes to pull back up, so you know if you were evicted from the cache or not. And the other one, load and reload, is their other attack. And just out of chat, asking about the domain the PDF's on. Yeah, we rehost a lot of the PDFs so we can kind of click around and scroll through them, share it. It's just my personal domain that's hosted on. The link that comes up in chat and the link in the description is the link to the PDF from its actual source.
Yeah, it's just a logistical thing.
Yeah, it's just my random domain. So going back to this attack though, the other one, load and reload, exploits kind of the fact that a physical address of RAM can only reside once within the L1 cache. If you attempt to access that same location from another virtual address or whatever, the old one will get evicted. So again, you can kind of see what another process is accessing that way by seeing if your memory gets evicted. Those are the 2 attacks based around that cache predictor. The issue is there's no... As I understand, I'm not an expert when it comes to something, but this may be an issue. It's essentially they found a way to pick this lock on this door, but this door is behind yet another door that's closed. There's no direct way to actually exploit this. Okay. So this may be an attack. Or this is likely an attack. They did spend some time. They did prove that this is an attack, to be fair. But it relies on some other issue like Spectre in order to start being able to hit that L1 cache and actually do this.
Would it be Spectre or Meltdown? Because I didn't think AMD was actually vulnerable to Spectre. I thought it was only vulnerable to Meltdown. Or
my notes are all saying they use Spectre.
Okay, so maybe I'm wrong on that.
There's definitely a chance. Yeah, so right in the report here it mentions is AMD CPUs are not vulnerable to Meltdown.
Oh, so I got it completely. Yeah. I got it the other way around. Okay.
So yeah, they were using Spectres, which has generally been patched. Yeah. But that is something that gets patched at the software level for the most part. Remove the timing ability, like the ability to get a good timer. Things like that. Yeah,
removing it from JavaScript engines was the big one.
Yeah, so that's the thing. With these attacks, there's definitely limits to it, and the amount of data being leaked here, we're talking about 4 bits out of a 64-bit cache line. Just the upper 4 bits.
Not very much.
No, not very much at all.
Especially, like you said, the upper 4 bits. And things like kernel, those are going to be consistent, generally, or a lot more consistent. Like the lower bytes are a lot more interesting for leaking.
Yeah. So just in terms of on Twitter, one of the authors actually mentioned they were asked the question, is this vulnerability as severe as meltdown or zombie load? Response: certainly not. The attack leaks a few bits of metadata. Meltdown and zombie load leak tons of actual data.
Damn, I gotta say that's kind of
and that's
kind of baller from the actual, the fact that he's not trying to play it up more than some other papers we've seen. I think that deserves some credit.
Yeah, so I can definitely give them some credit for that. They're not the ones trying to play this up. But of course, with AMD performing so well with Ryzen and all that recently, you're definitely kind of seeing the Intel AMD wars. The flames of that war have started back up in a very significant way. So seeing all the Intel issues and, here's something on AMD to kind of rally behind. But yeah, this issue is definitely a little bit limited. Like I said, the amount of data, and to be fair, they did manage to use this to apparently exfiltrate, I believe their demo was an AES key. So they have managed to get some data out from it.
Okay.
So there's something here. It is a real issue with the cache predictor, but the door to kind of get access to it is currently closed. So it's one of those things that it's going to be further down the chain. You're going to need something else yet to actually take advantage of this. It's not as bad as... Yeah, well, some sort of new attack, basically, on the CPU. And like I said, I want to kind of repeat again, this is really not an area of any expertise for me, so I do want to be careful with trying to downplay things when, my understanding is definitely limited. But my understanding is, there's that limit to where we're going to be able to see this used. And, I mean, it's an issue, but there's no path to access it at this point.
I guess the most interesting thing about it is, almost all the microarchitectural attacks we've seen in the last year or two have been against Intel. So it's kind of interesting to start seeing people at least looking more at AMD. Perhaps we'll start seeing more AMD issues in the future. Maybe, the tables are going to kind of turn on that. I don't know.
Maybe, but I mean, part of the reason AMD has kind of avoided a lot of those issues is because of their architecture in general has let that
shortcuts.
Yeah, I mean that's the big thing here. Those shortcuts are biting Intel now, whereas AMD did it a little bit more responsibly. Now, will we likely see some issues against AMD? Absolutely. I mean, there are going to be some issues that nobody's thought of yet. Whatever. There are issues. Everything's always vulnerable. But in this case, I mean, it's not just... I don't believe it's just as simple as saying, well, Intel's more popular, therefore people are looking at it. There is a clear distinction here that AMD did at least take some of the right steps in terms of thinking about some of the speculation and just operating securely instead of just speculating on data that it shouldn't have access to while it checks to see if it has access to it and things like that. So I don't know, I just want to put that out there for AMD. I do think there's probably some issue out there that's going to be AMD only, but these microarchitectural things have been largely Intel only because of just fundamental issues with decisions of Intel, not just kind of general bugs in code, but fundamental decisions.
Yeah. So our next topic actually has two issues, and they're a lot more recent. They're not from 2019.
Yeah, two issues that work together.
Yeah. So this is by CMU. I can never pronounce the first word. Carne Mellon University. I think that's the way you say it. I'm just going to go with it. But it's in the point-to-point protocol daemon, pppd. And the first issue is basically a buffer overflow and the way they process extensible authentication protocol packets. The second issue is a logic bug, which actually allows you to send or allows unauthenticated parties to send packets, even if the authentication was refused. So that's where he was kind of saying you kind of chain them together to get that unauthenticated buffer overflow.
Yeah, specifically, sending the EAP packets. Without actually passing the authentication.
Yeah. So getting into some of the specifics, the buffer overflow, it was specifically in two functions, EAP request and EAP response. You can actually look at the source code. It is open source. And those functions are called by the input handler. And they take a pointer and a length, and these basically the length resides in 1 byte. And then they copy the host name using that size. They actually do try to do like a check, a bounds check, but the check is flawed. They basically check if the length is more than the length plus the hostname size, but they'd already verified that the input length was less than LEN, which is what they were checking with. So the statement's basically never true. And the reason that's an issue is if that statement succeeds, the buffer gets truncated. So because they basically made an if statement that can never succeed because of the logic bug, the buffer never gets truncated and therefore it overflows. The other issue wasn't directly referenced in the article, but I was able to find the patch for it by quickly checking the commits of the repo. And the other issue just seems to be that they don't check the state to make sure the state isn't closed when they process packets. So if you look in the commit, they just add checks.
Do you happen to have the link to the commit?
I don't have it readily on me, but I can probably get to it really quickly because it should be in my history. Just because I think
so if you've got it, pull it into the chat to show it up, or not chat, pull it onto the browser to show us the code.
Right now, actually, I
did not take a look at the code, so I'm kind of interested to see the.
So here's the unauthenticated packets check. You can see they just add these if statements in there for checking if EAP closed, and then they just bail out early. And then the other one was actually in the previous commit to that.
And so I'm going to
check an EAP code.
I'm just going to mention just as an aside thing, but I've always felt like on the last file that you show with their patch, doing those single-lined, non-enclosed if statements. Mm-hmm. Personally, I felt like that's just a bad security move to do that. I'm always like, if you want to do a one-liner, keep it all on one line. Just because I want to say there's an Apple issue where somebody just added another line in there and didn't enclose it, so then the if statement wasn't running correctly. Mm-hmm. So like my feeling is just always wrap it. And I know that's not like, I'm pretty sure even the Linux kernel style guide is putting it onto a new line, indenting it, but not wrapping it. So I know this is a common style, but it's one style that I kind of disagree with. I think you should always wrap it if you're going to have a multi-line statement.
Just in case you want to add to it later, you don't have to worry about missing those braces, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, it's not a huge concern. Most people are going to notice it, or if it doesn't run, like it's going to be a noticeable issue. But at the same time, it's just catching those little errors that do happen every so often.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean that's kind of a side note on my personal opinion there, but
personal hot take. I don't think it's a hot take. I you know what? I want to say I agree with it, but I will be honest. I have personally done this. I've personally written, those one-line if statements. So, I'd be a hypocrite if I said that.
Well, so I'm fine with one-line if statements. I just think they should be on one line rather than having that second line going to a new line, like having the actual statement on a new line.
Yeah, but I still do that, so I can't criticize too much.
Fair enough. To be fair, I've done it too.
Yeah.
That said, I mean it does seem out of chat. Balika does disagree with me.
Yeah, everyone disagrees with you. You're on your own island.
Yep.
But but no, I can see like your point for sure. But yeah, this issue was kind of interesting just because it's a bit more of a subtle issue. It typically when you like a lot of the buffer overflows we cover, it's straight up just like they didn't even consider it. There's no check at all. This time there was a check, but there was a subtle logic bug that was basically making that check useless. So that's what kind of makes the bug a little bit more cool. It's one of those more subtle logic bugs. So it's more fun to look at. And the other part of it that's cool is that it's basically two separate issues that you chain together to make it a more serious issue.
Yeah,
those kind of multi-stage attacks are always more fun to cover as well.
Yeah.
So our next issue is in Android. Specifically MediaTek. Android put out a security bulletin. They pushed out a lot of fixes in Qualcomm and system fixes, but the most notable one that kind of blew up was the MediaTek one. And this was because details about the bug were already floating around on the XDA developer forums
sounds like this
April.
Well, it sounds like it was reported and patched by MediaTek in April, but it was floating around since February 2019.
Okay, I have April 2019, so maybe I was...
I have April as being the date of... I remember writing April initially, but then looking at the forums and seeing February. So I believe April was in reference specifically to either MediaTek patching it. Although it does seem to say here April, so perhaps I'm mistaken.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a discrepancy in their article there. Because
although it does mention down here in February of 2019, this XDA member Diplomatic published kind of the first thread about that fire tablet Bell realizing that exploit. So
might be a slight error in the opening paragraph of the article.
Dates are hard.
Yeah. The other thing that's interesting too is you'll notice the last sentence there. Now MediaTek has turned to Google to close this patch gap. Those kind of keywords, patch gap, kind of supports what you were saying, that it was patched but it didn't reach Android downstream, of course.
Yeah, well, so it was definitely patched by MediaTek. That's clear because they have the advisory even published about it well before this, but I believe they do mention, I think there was an update either in this or elsewhere over whether or not MediaTek actually reached out to Google for this, or if Google just became aware of it not being patched and kind of pushed for that. Because obviously MediaTek can't force any of the vendors to update. Google, however, has a little bit more power to do that.
Yeah, they have that kind of stick of authority with Android where they can kind of beat, device authors over the head to try to fix stuff. But yeah, I mean, the other notable point in this article is that it was being exploited by hackers in the wild actively, which was supported by the fact that it was already published by this guy in the XDA forums before it was patched.
There's that. I mean, look at the issue though. It's literally the CMDQ kernel driver has a couple ioctls, or allocated write address and execute command. Yeah,
so I'll get into that now. There was a lot of talk around this because it was being described as a rootkit. And like you were saying, that's because the issue is basically that the driver has ioctl commands that allow you to allocate direct DMA buffers and read and write to physical memory. And you can, being able to read and write to physical memory is basically game over. You can just scribble over the privilege fields. You can disable SE Linux directly through physical memory. It's not even a memory corruption bug or anything like that. It seems to be an exposed intended functionality. It's a serious issue. That being said, I don't know if I agree with classifying it as a rootkit. I think backdoor might be a bit more accurate.
Well, I mean, a backdoor, like a rootkit is a backdoor. It is a way of maintaining and keeping that root.
The reason I say that is typically when you hear rootkit, it's with malicious intent. That's often tagged. That often comes with the term.
I don't know.
I think was more of a debugging thing that was left in there that wasn't, blocked off for production devices.
I would argue for keeping it as called rootkit just because we have seen that expanded definition of rootkit used when it came to like Sony and their DRM on CDs many years ago, where they would install kind of that backdoor. I mean, it wasn't with a malicious intent, but it could be you. But obviously, malware actually did start using that backdoor. They had this system in there to like hide certain files from being visible and stuff. I forget all of the details, but I would still count this as a rootkit, even though it's like I agree with what you're saying. This probably wasn't like an intended backdoor or anything. This was probably just something left in there accidentally. Although, you know, we can speculate about actual intent and all of that, but assuming the best, even if it wasn't done maliciously, I think we could still call it a rootkit because it is effectively a backdoor into getting that deep level of access.
Yeah.
Whereas I hate chemistry mentions there's no difference between malice and a mistake.
I disagree with that. I mean,
well, I mean, it depends on what you're talking about, but when we're talking about the actual consequences of it, the intent doesn't even matter. The consequence of it is
like it when it's actually being used. You're right. The intent doesn't really matter, but I think that is worth considering. Like, I would consider this a lot worse if it was somehow proven that they left this in there intentionally. You know what I mean? Whatever you call it, though, it's certainly incompetence. I mean, whatever way you look at it, that's just really dumb to leave that kind of functionality.
Oh, for sure. Like, I'm definitely not trying to defend leaving it in there by any means. Just, I think the term rootkit's kind of fair to use.
Okay. But yeah, like, you know, it's the issue itself is very straightforward. It's not as fun to look at as the last one. It's literally just being able to write to physical memory. So yeah, good that was
it's a good feature for your phone.
Good feature, yeah. I
or tablet.
Yeah. I was saying yesterday in our chat, I think that we should just let processes write to physical memory anyways. You know, I think we should remove that performance overhead of that virtual layer. Just just let everyone write for physical memory. Nobody's going to do anything bad. We'll just trust everything anyway. It'll be fine.
Trust everything. It's all good.
Yeah, trust implicitly. That's a good security model to have. Trust.
Just to be clear, this is definitely being said in jest. When we had a separate discussion that led us down this crazy road. In jest, do not, any chip designers out there, do not take our ideas.
Yeah, don't listen to us. But yeah, we'll move on from that. Our next issue comes from Source Insight, and it was a ManageEngine deserialization issue in the Zoho ManageEngine. So I will say I don't know why they use this like Comic Sans like font on their page. It's truly sinful. I wasn't a big fan of it.
I don't think this is Comic Sans. This has got to be something else.
It's not, but it looks like it. It's
Comic Sans plus style. The terminal-ish look. Yeah, it's a weird pairing, but
whatever.
Yeah, whatever. At least they gave a good amount of detail about the issue, and I'll say it's kind of two issues. Obviously, this is yet another deserialization attack. We've talked about several of them. We actually have yet another one. Basically, deserialization of untrusted data leading to the ability to execute arbitrary code as system/root. And it comes down to two things. The first thing, and I'm going to open up the proof of concept file here. And this proof of concept, actually, it's a little bit hard to follow just because of how they do the writing, but on a whole, like, they cover all the important details. The deserialization happens, you've basically just got a request in the CEWolf servlet that takes an image parameter. That image parameter is effectively part of the file name. It builds up the path, appends the image parameter that you provide, which presumably is some sort of image file for these graphs. I'm not actually sure what it is, but it reads it as a serialized Java object. So it creates the object input stream, calls read object on the file that it ends up building. They mention in this that it's also vulnerable to like path traversal. They don't do any sort of sanitization on that image parameter, but it doesn't even matter in this case. Of course, you do need to be able to get a file on the server, which is where kind of the second issue comes in. And tackling the question of chat from I Hate Chemistry, is this related to Pickle? Yeah, Pickle's another serialization. Basically, every language generally has its own way to serialize objects and to deserialize them, and usually there's some form, some mechanism through which you can get code execution.
Gadgets, yeah.
Yeah, there's usually some set of gadgets that'll result in code execution that you can find. Well, maybe I shouldn't say usually. It does take a little bit of effort, but at this point, a lot of the major applications, those gadgets have already kind of been discovered. So, like in Java applications, there are certain Apache gadgets if you're using some of the Commons libraries, or there are gadgets that are kind of well known to lead to code execution when you deserialize untrusted data. So as I was saying, though, with this one, CUwolf takes basically a file name as its input. No, not quite, but essentially file name is input. So as long as you can provide that file with your own data, it'll deserialize it. So the other issue is with the MDM log uploader servlet. Again, it takes in a file name. I'm just trying to find it on screen.
Yeah,
So it takes in the file name here. Literally just right off the URL. It does do a little bit of sanitization. It has this lovely function here, file upload detail dot has vulnerability in file name, which I like the name. What it does is it looks basically for your path traversals in there, and you give it a white list of extensions that it's allowed to use. But effectively, again, you can give it any file name you want as long as it matches. But again, path traversal is an issue. While it does this look on the file name, it also uses this other parameter UDID as part of the actual path. Just appends it straight in. So they protect the file name, but there are other parameters to protect too.
Yeah, and basically the deserialization issue in that basically completely negates that file name check, because with the deserialization you can just bypass it entirely.
This is how you get to the deserialization. You upload the file to deserialize using this vulnerability here. And I will mention they also do the absolute file name, and they resolve it at this point. Just by mentioning anybody writing code, this is how you prevent path traversals. And they don't do it here. Resolve the absolute file name, check that the absolute file name is still within your base directory. It's still within where you want it. That's all you really need to do. Just resolve it and take a look. You don't need to look for, or you shouldn't look for it in the path, because it's kind of a cat and mouse game. Just let the operating system resolve it and take a look if it's still where you want it to be. That way you can actually have some confidence in not being able to avoid it. That said, the path traversal isn't actually needed here. Effectively, you've got your file upload with whatever file name you want going into whatever directory you want. That you can, or the file type or the extension doesn't really matter here, because you can provide that into the graph loader. So upload your file with one issue, it gets read by the other. A fairly straightforward issue.
Another multi-stage attack.
Yeah, multi-stage, I guess, but I'd say it's yet another deserialization attack. I actually have yada written in my notes.
I will say one thing that was kind of caught my attention in the article directly, not in the actual issue, was at the time, actually, I think they just updated this page today, because when I was looking at it yesterday, they didn't mention that it had been fixed. I think they actually disclosed this before the actual patch was released, and that's actually what happened. They said public 0-day release 5th of March, and then the CVE assigned and patch release on the 6th. So they issued it. They disclosed the 0-day. They basically dropped the 0-day because it was put out before it was fixed. What I thought was really weird, though, was they have this disclosure timeline, and they put December 12th for discovery, but they don't have anything for when they submitted it. I don't know if discovery implies that they submitted it on the same day as discovery, or if it's a typo or whatnot, but it doesn't seem clear that they actually sent it to them to actually get fixed.
Given the fact that it was only fixed after the public release, I would say they probably didn't.
But see, what makes me think like what confuses me is the fact that they waited so long, right? Like December 12th to March 5th.
Maybe
That's
they were
close
using
to a
it.
90-day disclosure, maybe. But like,
No,
I don't
that's
know.
fair point, actually.
That suggests like a 90-day disclosure deadline. It's not quite 90 days, it's 84 days. But if they were going to just try to drop it maliciously or like without caring, why wait that long? You know what I mean? So that's what kind of confused me on that.
Yeah, that's fair. I don't have any answer to that.
I'm going to say I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt just because they waited so long. That it is possible that
given that they
this.
do have the CVE assigned for it, it's also presumably, I don't know if the CVE was in there, but I'm just reading up on here. But since they have the CVE number assigned to it, although, yeah, I was going to say, although CVE number is in 2020. And it's a pretty late number.
Yeah, they could have added
like that's 10,189, whereas, if it was early, because if they found it in December, maybe had a little bit of time before they actually had number reserved, they should have had early 2020. So that CV might have come from ManageEngine, like from them.
So yeah, it's just kind of weird. I just do kind of wonder if maybe they submitted it and then they wouldn't take it seriously, and then that's why they dropped it publicly.
Yeah, but then why not mention it?
Before. Yeah, so yeah, it's just kind of weird,
Yeah, I agree with you. I didn't take note of that before, but yeah, it is.
Yeah, so well, we can make assumptions, but there's no concrete information we can go on there, unfortunately. But I think we can move on to our yet another
deserialization one. This time in Oracle's WebLogic server, and I'm not going to spend too much time with this. It's another deserialization in T3 protocol messages. What this actually, the ZDI report here actually spends a lot more time, rather than talking about kind of the actual issue and the core of the issue, talking about basically reverse engineering it from the patch, which makes it kind of an interesting read to try and figure out what the issue was on that basis. So that's why I'm kind of leaving this more as a shout out to give it a read through. It's an interesting read. The issue itself, I don't think was all that interesting. Just yet another deserialization one to, notch it up a bit or add another notch to the belt.
It was kind of weird that they took that angle of trying to work backwards from a patch.
Well, presumably it's patch diffing in general.
Yeah, but presumably they would have had the details because the guy who sent it, like the Zhang guy they mentioned, reported it to them. So they would have had all the details. So I just wonder why they took that approach when they didn't have to. Yeah, it just seems kind of weird because... Yeah, it was from ZDI 2128. It was reported directly to them, and then they forwarded it to the vendor. So it's just weird that they worked backwards in the patch when they had more information to work from. Maybe that was just an approach they wanted to take for fun or something like that. But, I thought that was kind of weird. Another weird thing that I noticed in the article.
Yeah, just out of chat asking about patch diffing on .NET. So with patch diffing on .NET, obviously it's different than patch diffing on a binary, just because you're able to patch diff on the CRL, the Common Runtime Language, which is a heck of a lot easier than trying to do it with binary, but it does exist. I've used it on a couple assessments. I can't make mention of any clients, but where we didn't have source, but I did have access, I was able to exfil some older stuff and then use that to kind of find where areas had changed. Not quite patch diffing because I was finding new vulnerabilities, but I'd use that to kind of find what areas had changed. So yeah, it does exist. I mean, it is something you can do.
Yeah. But yeah, just a quick shout out. But that angle is kind of cool. It's always fun to see that going backwards.
Yeah, I like most of ZDI's write-up, so they get a lot of coverage from us.
Yeah, ZDI in general. We love covering Pondo and we love covering their articles. So we're not shills or anything. I just want to throw that out there. But our next set of issues is in parse-server, which is a Node.js backend server module.
So parse, I hate parse. I mean, I'm sure it can be done right.
Vendettas coming up.
No. I mean, every time I've seen it used, there have been some very significant issues with it. It essentially comes down to the fact that, generally speaking, parse is used where people don't want to have like a back end. They want to be able to do everything, including querying the database from their front end client or from a mobile application.
Yeah.
So this isn't crazy thought. Like, this is, Firebase out of Google. I'm sure AWS has something too. Like, it's not a new idea necessarily. So basically, you're able to set a lot more granular rules for access compared with a more traditional relational database. Anyway, the fun little issue is you can essentially query. When you do the queries, you can query with a regex field. You can just give it here regex that you want to query by. So instead of knowing a session token to use, you can just give it a regex query to find any one session token that works, basically. Yeah. Really simple issue. Basically just something that should be disabled, but that's all it takes, is just querying the session tokens with regex to find all the valid accounts that way.
And really simple, fun, but to use it. Like, you can use it on that page they mention, or that API endpoint for like getting user data, but you can also use it in like the verify email mechanism. You can use it in the password reset mechanism. So it's not just in that one area, it's in like 3 different areas.
Yeah, so that in particular is also, with the particular application, the Kickbox app. Like the particular verifying reset password examples. Yeah. But generally speaking, it's just you can use regex queries.
It's fun to see
to do the session. Yeah.
It's fun to see some of the regex injection stuff, because I remember a few episodes ago we talked about it in the context of denial of service through regex. I think it's kind of apparent that a lot of people don't really consider the implications of what allowing regex parsing could, what kind of impact that could have. Well, the
implications are really the issue when it comes to a lot of cloud services. So, just the implication of keep like your whatever rules you set, not just with regex. I mean, the other big thing in cloud is just, hey, everybody gets to read everything, which is what I tended to see when I'd see parse being used, is you can pull up like everything. Like, I remember one application, they had these coupon codes that they would assign to people. Well, when you're querying the parse application, you could like query all of the little, I'm going to say tables, I think there's another, or documents would be, I think, the proper name for. And you can see like, hey, there's this coupon document, let's just read it. And, here's all the coupons for like free downloads of the app or whatever. And things like that. Like, there's just a lot of implications that come with using cloud services that application developers just aren't thinking about yet. There is more knowledge, especially around S3 buckets these days, and just cloud drives in general, or cloud storage in general, I should say. This regex one, I could understand kind of missing it. It's implemented as like this feature of the whole query language, and you just kind of forget about that implication. Like, I could understand missing it.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing with this, is with Node.js, I think this package, when I looked at it, I think it's being used by like about 2,500 other packages. So, this issue could like
parse is definitely used very widely.
Yeah, so that's kind of like the, why it's more of a serious issue, because of how much it can propagate. But yeah, it's been fixed in 4.1.0. So, if you're running parse for whatever reason, it's probably a good idea to update that. Getting into some HackerOne stuff, though, we have another bug related to Node.js, but this time it's in Node.js itself.
Yeah, and to be fair, so this one, we're just covering it now because it was just disclosed, but it is, I think, 3 years old.
Was it 3 years? I remember seeing it.
Okay,
no,
maybe I must be thinking of the next. Yeah, okay, it's the next one that's 3 years old. My bad.
Okay. But yeah, this issue is dubbed HTTP request smuggling. Now, I'll be honest, I wasn't familiar with these kinds of attacks. I'm not huge into web. I mostly stay, in my comfort zone of binary. This one I had to look into a little bit more because I haven't really seen this kind of attack. But from what I can understand, it's basically an attack on systems that use a front-end server, like a load balancer, and a back-end server, and there's like a discrepancy between the software running on both of them.
Yeah, so in particular, this is a desync attack. It results in request smuggling, but the actual attack is a desync, which basically happens where you have one part of the server using... the server will parse the same request different ways. So your front end might parse it one way, and the back end will parse it another way, which is what happens here, or which is what can happen here. When it comes to this, so you can send your HTTP messages multiple different ways. The classic way is, when you're learning HTTP, you just kind of see the request as a whole, and you can imagine it just being sent like a file piece, or just like this line, just sent like that. But there's also transfer encoding, chunked is an option. So you send the transfer encoding header with the value chunked, and then you can send the body in this chunked format, which allows you to start sending things kind of out of order, and you just specify like the length and where it is in the request. So if you submit a request, in this case, that has both transfer encoding, so it says it's some sort of transfer encoding header, and a content length. Now, content length is used when you send it just kind of like the file in a synchronous form. So when you see the difference between them, where one server is going to prefer that content length and the other server prefers the transfer encoding, that's where you get the desync between them. And you end up with a single request that's usually done with this chunked encoding, but the other server treats it as though it's got the content length and just kind of reads it as a whole. You can look into it. Like I said, it's a desync attack in particular. Put that into Google, you'll get a ton of results about it. But that's kind of the gist of it, is causing the front end and the back end to get out of sync. So the back end, it thinks 2 requests came in, whereas the front end only saw 1.
Yeah, and what can be an issue is you can basically deliver payloads that are potentially malicious to other, users.
So payloads. The other thing you could do is you can start leaking internal information with it. Like if the front end is adding headers, you can kind of craft your request such that that header becomes part of one of the post parameter, and if you have a request that'll what am I thinking? If you have a request that'll echo out that post parameter or something, you'll be able to leak information out from it. Like, you can kind of craft requests to get internal information.
That's a cool attack too.
And the other thing is, because you're potentially able to bypass like the web application firewall, because again, the front end's usually thinking this is just one request, and the back end, sorry, I'm just trying to see what library. I mean, they use Express, but I'm not sure if it's in Express or if it's right in the node. Okay, so it's in the HTTP parser library.
Okay.
Which Express uses. That's what I want to figure out. So that's right from node. It's not external from that. Anyway, so the request comes into the front end, comes into your load balancer as one request, and then Express gets it, or HTTP parser gets it, and it's like, hey, this is actually 2 requests. And from that, like I said, if it adds any headers in there, you're able to leak that. You're able to hit internal endpoints. So if the web application firewall of the front end would have blocked a request to say like /internal/admin, and all of a sudden you're able to hit that because you're able to smuggle the request in. So there's definitely a lot of things that could be done with this. I'd say, look up the desync attack if you kind of want to understand that attack level. Otherwise, request smuggling, again, is a well talked about topic. kind of you'll find some older resources about too, back with like CRLF injection stuff.
I remember seeing when I was looking into it, there was some stuff from like 2005, which is why I felt kind of dumb for like not knowing about this attack before.
Yeah, well, it's one of those attacks that was around, was kind of interesting for a bit. The CRLF stuff resulting in sort of request smuggling, but then it disappeared forever. And
Not
then
forever.
just for quite a long time, and then just more recently, we've started seeing it come up again more. We've started seeing new ways of getting it and stuff.
Kind of forgotten about it, and yeah.
So that's why, like, it's really just been in the last few years that we're starting to see the uptick in it again.
So just to, put a cap on that, the way they worded the issue officially was they said HTTP parser doesn't comply with RFC 7320, which basically says, you should reject headers that specify both a transfer encoding and content length header, because, it ought to be handled as an error, basically, because it's most likely somebody's trying to pull off a smuggling attack.
Well, yeah, there's no reason to have both headers in there. If you're doing a transfer encoding with chunk, there's no reason to provide a content length, because there is no content length. Like, that's part of kind of the transfer encoding. That includes the length. So yeah, that's the core of the issue here. I guess we spent a lot of time talking about request smuggling, and probably poorly, so sorry for those of you trying to learn from me, but there are better resources on Google that you can use to kind of learn about that. But yeah, the gist of it is, it does violate the spec. It should just reject that as an invalid request. The HTTP parser doesn't. Therefore, you can kind of create this abuse.
I will say from chat, K9 Team K9, inspired by true events, Al Pacino, Amazon Original Hunters. That's kind of a straight fire line. I will say that. I wanted to kind of give that shout out, because that's pretty good. That made me chuckle while you were reading. I was trying to wait to bring it up, because I didn't want to interrupt you, but I thought that was pretty good. But yeah, it's neat. It's one of those fun discrepancies that you can play with, that you can kind of play around with.
Actually, that's something I actually had a little note here to mention. This is one of those issues. You just play around with it and you'll get to understand it. As you've noticed, I'm kind of struggling to really explain how it works and stuff, but if you take the time, build up a little lab to play around with the attack, it makes a lot more sense when you see it happen and actually play around with it. So I'll say that. I don't have a lab that I can just link you to, but the issue, you can probably figure that out. It's one of those issues that makes a lot more sense if you just play with it a little bit.
Yeah. Now, our next issue is kind of weird in that the issue in itself is neat, but the impact is like really low to non-existent, really, because you need admin permissions to pull it off anyway, and it doesn't really extend your capability as an admin, because you can already do what this attack lets you do.
Yeah, so the title here, delete all data of any user. This is with Nextcloud.
Yeah. So I think it's worth talking about, just because the vector used is kind of interesting. Essentially, when a user is created, they're given a folder which is named by with the username of that user, with no prefix or anything like that. And if you can create a user with the username of dot, which is basically the typical directory entry for the current directory, you can delete that user to wipe the contents of the entire directory and delete the data of all users. That being said, with admin access, you can already delete users, as the vendors point out. So the impact is low to basically none. But it's still kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's a bug. It's less of a security thing, although they did give a bounty of $250 for it, which is fair.
A bounty for it.
It's an issue. I mean, that shouldn't happen. Maybe it also causes some other things with availability or something too. If there are other files besides just directories in there for users, but as an admin, you can already delete all the users individually and recreate this, or presumably you can. I haven't actually used Nextcloud to confirm that. Perhaps there is an account that you can't delete. But yeah, this is also the issue. It was disclosed 3 years ago. Or it was, disclosed to Nextcloud 3 years ago, but they just disclosed it publicly a week ago.
Yeah, I never even noticed how old that issue actually was. So
I've noticed this happens a lot with the hacker one. I've been using their activity page to kind of see what's coming up each week, and there are a lot of kind of older bugs that just are getting disclosed now for whatever reason.
I was gonna say, like, that's kind of interesting. I wonder why that's the case. If there's just like a push for wanting to get more publicity for the reports out there or something after a while. I don't know.
Well, oh no, this one looks like just the author requested to disclose that after 3 years. So they say they just forgot to, which is definitely a possibility. Just wasn't thinking about it then. Now they're thinking about it.
Back into his mind 3 years later.
Probably just looking over his whole list to be like, oh, this one isn't disclosed.
Looking at the trophy case, but yeah. So, it's kind of a fun issue, but,
yeah, that's definitely why I included it. It's a fun little issue, create the user dot and delete the current working directory. It's fun. It's not all that useful, but it's fun.
Yeah.
Speaking of fun, though, there is also the ability to, in this case, dismantling Immobiliser systems, which I thought was a very, very opaque name.
Interesting way of wording it, yeah. Yeah. But we do love cars. This is basically cars. That's what they mean.
Yeah, this is vehicle immobilizer systems, or effectively like car key. So with the issues here, this comes out of I actually forget what. Transaction on Cryptography, Hardware, and Embedded Systems. So this is a journal, fairly technical, with crypto focus. It gets pretty deep into the weeds here with it. But the gist of what they found here, first of all, they use just voltage glitching to get through any sort of firmware protection to extract firmware from these. And then they attempted to look at basically how keys are generated, how the crypto works. And they go through kind of reverse engineering that, looking at that. Because obviously vehicles can't just use standard crypto. They're going to use some proprietary system. What they found was that, for example, with the Toyota system, it relies on publicly readable information to generate the crypto keys. So you can recreate all their crypto keys based on the transponder serial, and they mentioned just 3 constants. They also looked at Kia and Hyundai. Their keys only have 3 bytes of entropy. So again, very, very much brute forceable.
It's always going to be good when you see proprietary crypto system in there.
Of course.
Whenever you see that, it's going to be secure. But we love car hacking, so
Yeah. So I mean, it's something that I think a lot of people. A lot of people are kind of interested in seeing that. Unfortunately, I mean, this is also... So one of the other things they do is they do a differential power analysis. And they find that this is basically trivially exploited. Yeah, so every byte of the key is loaded. It's loaded in sequence, and there's a clear power difference depending on the value of the key. So
that could be fun as a project if you're interested in doing like low-level side channeling and stuff. Like if you're interested in pulling off differential power analysis attacks and voltage glitching. It sounds like there's like basically no protections against that. So
yeah, so they found that you could extract
first target.
They found that you can get out the entire key in just as little as 10 traces with the differential power analysis. As being just one of their side channels that they used. And I feel like, like you said, I mean, it feels a little bit like an intro level thing if you want to play around with that sort of attack. Not to say that this research paper is intro level. It's...
No, voltage and stuff like that is already pretty getting into like black magic, So
yeah, I'm not wanting to downplay the paper because the paper goes into a lot. They obviously did a lot of work here. I'm not...
pages.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to downplay that, but going along with what Spectre said, it might be an area to look at if you want to try this out. Like, it seems like something that might be easy to do or easier to do than some other sources. Granted, it might also just be our lack of knowledge to actually say that. But I don't know. What do you think, though, about the actual value of this sort of attack? Because my thought is, you're doing a power analysis on a key. This isn't wireless. This isn't something like... So the attacks where it comes down to the limited entropy, those are, that's just car manufacturers doing stupid things. That's par for the course. But the differential power analysis, I don't know, it just seems like... I don't know, I could imagine like maybe a valet is going to have time with the key to do that. But
yeah,
it's
like regarding the DPA and stuff, in practicality, there's easier ways. You know what I mean? It's not really going to be useful for practical attack, I don't think. I think where the value in this actually like really comes from is the process that was taken to get there. I think the actual research that went into it is a lot more useful than the actual practical implications of it. And that's why I was saying, like, I think if you're looking to break into hardware and stuff, I think this might be a good resource for you to look at. Just because that process,
the paper is definitely a bit dense, though.
It is a bit dense, but like getting insight into that process is one of the things that's always been the hardest about breaking into hardware. Because if you ask a hardware person, how do you get into voltage glitching? How do you get into DPA? They're just kind of like, oh, well, you just do this and you just, get better with it over time. It's not really an answer that really helps you all that much if you're trying to get started in it. I think this, this journal, as you called it, has a lot of useful information in that regard.
Well, to be clear, this is just an article from the journal. This isn't the entire journal.
Okay, but still, like,
their release was
what I mean?
Like just last week.
Yeah, it's still got a lot of like useful insight and stuff. So practically, I don't think it's too interesting, but I think the research angle of it is...
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, just because of how quickly you might be able to do the 10 traces for the power analysis, like, I can see some potential in that being abused.
You need a good setup for that, though. Like, you can't just, like...
It would have to be... It would be very targeted again. Like, we've talked about some other targeted attacks. Like, this isn't something that we're...
You're not going to hit a mom at a grocery store with this.
Well, actually, I mean... Yeah, you'd have to have stolen the key already, which is probably going to be noticed by the time you got to a place to do the power analysis, even though it could kind of be done quickly. The valet is the one area I can kind of see it being used, though, because the vehicles are being left for a while. You've got enough time to try and pull the key out of the key.
Yeah, and it's, depending on where you're doing it, there is typically like more expensive cars going through valet too, so
yeah,
that's a decent point. But overall, I still think like the research is far more valuable than the
yeah. I mean, it points out the obvious: proprietary crypto is generally being done bad.
Yep. Don't roll your own crypto. Bad idea.
So I guess to be fair, technically speaking, the manufacturers are not deploying their own crypto. It is Texas Instruments. They're the ones that created this crypto system, the DST80.
I just need a calculator with crypto. That's all I need. But yeah, we'll move into our research section, which is our last section of the podcast, and we'll start it off with exploring backdoor poisoning attacks against malware classifiers. This is one that you wanted to bring up, Z, because it's centered around something you brought up a while ago on the show. With this backdoor malware detection.
Well, yeah, backdooring malware detection. It's something way back on episode 2 we had talked just generally about backdooring neural networks, and back then I kind of quipped about the idea of using that attack, but against malware or against like antiviruses and stuff. And I've mentioned that a couple other times as it's come up. But it was just one of those ideas sitting in the back of my mind in terms of taking the idea of, adding a backdoor into an antivirus, into some sort of system like that. And this paper, as most of these things that attack, classifiers that attack neural networks and all of that, gets reasonably deep into some of the technical aspects, but
lots of math formulas, yeah.
But the gist of these sorts of attacks of backdooring is you add some sort of watermark. So when we're talking about an image, that makes pretty clear sense. You add this little watermark, something that the model can be trained to detect, that it'll know and it'll think is okay. And if you're able to inject enough training data, and that's why antiviruses are kind of an interesting source, is because they do crowdsource their training data. They look for people and new binaries existing on their system and then submit those to kind of train the network on, is this safe or not? So in this case, if you're able to create enough binaries, create enough applications that have some sort of watermark, some sort of feature that the neural network will train on, and you're able to create the association that this watermark that only your applications have is safe, then you can now create or try to create a evil or malicious binary that has that watermark that then, because of the previous association, gets marked as safe. And I mean, the paper goes into reasonable depth about the different features that some of these options will work with or will detect. And why some work or some won't work. Talks about feature hashing. But they found, 32 directly manipulatable non-hashed features that they can play around with. I believe they have a list that I'm trying to bring up here, but...
Yeah, so while you try to look for that list, I'll say I think one thing that this paper really tries to highlight is one of those differences between some of the attacks we talked about before, which is mostly visual classifiers, images and stuff like that, especially in the context of self-driving cars. What you don't have in the malware sample area is you can't poison the labels, which is the attacks we talked about before. A lot of them did talk about poisoning the labels. In the malware classifiers, you don't have the control over those labels. So to their knowledge, this is the first time that anyone studied attacking malware classifiers with a clean label backdoor attack. So that is, I think, worth mentioning. That it is they are kind of trying to hit it in a way that's harder than what we've seen in the past, because of that limitation. But yeah, they try to go for that feature-based detection. When you talk about antiviruses, they have a few different ways of detecting issues in binary samples. The two main routes are dynamic analysis, where they execute the binary in a containered environment, and then the other one is static analysis, and that's where this feature-based detection comes into play. And when you're trying to hit malware classifiers, you're typically trying to pull off one of two attacks. The more obvious one is you try to fool a classifier into a false negative, thinking that your malware isn't malware, so that it gets through. The other route you can go, though, is cause legitimate programs to be flagged as malware to hurt the efficiency of the software, or trigger false positives. And that's what they focus on in this paper, is backdoor poisoning attacks to inject patterns into the model.
I did find the list here, which includes things like the major image version, major linker version, minor versions of the same, certain little things that are part of the binary that they can play around with to create these watermarks. So I just wanted to pull that up on stream to kind of show the type of data that they were manipulating to create these watermarks that would be recognized by the AI.
Yeah, it's really good to bring up. I do find it interesting that things like the size of the code segment and the header table is relevant to the antivirus. I think that's kind of interesting.
Well, I think part of it just comes down to the fact that it would just look at those things and maybe size plus something else. Obviously, it's not just being okay, if its size is exactly equal to 482. Then it's malware.
If you're using a Golang binary, it's malware. Large code segments.
But I mean, it's just one of those things that it is a feature of the file that it can notice and it can reason about. Obviously, a lot of these things aren't explicable AI. It doesn't really tell you how it's reasoning about it. It knows this feature and this feature and this feature, when they're like this, is unsafe. Or is probably unsafe, and it has nothing to do with the actual code. It has everything to do with just what they've seen elsewhere. I mean, again, a lot of the AI, it's applied statistics in a sense.
Yeah, I will say, unfortunately, this paper is a less accessible than some of the other papers we've covered in the past. Obviously, like you said, AI, it's already going to be statistically based, so there is going to be math in it, and it's going to be a bit complex. But it's still expects you to have some background knowledge. It doesn't give you some of that break in, get your feet wet introduction that some of the other white papers we've covered have. So I think that's, important to note for anybody that's interested in it but doesn't have that background necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to cover this paper, as you kind of mentioned there, because it's an idea I had floating around in my head for a little while. And it's nice to see somebody, yes, clearly they stole this idea from my head. Or just from listening to the podcast.
Yeah,
they must listen to me, yeah. No, I mean, obviously that's probably not the case, but it's still a fun idea. It is one of those things where you can abuse AI, and malware seems like a great place to try and do that.
Did you search for your name? See if they credited you for the idea?
They definitely did not credit me for it.
Oh, okay. But yeah, I think in the end they found it was generally pretty effective. They said that with a pool of like 1% of the training set poisoned, you could achieve like a high degree of success. I think the figure I saw thrown around was 97% success rate or higher. It was something like really crazy like that. So, it's a bit hard to understand how the attack actually works, but it does seem to be a pretty effective attack. So
yeah, I mean, like I said, the gist of it is add a watermark on safe data or on how you want it to be detected, basically. And that watermark may or may not be detected later as the same thing. Like it's you can understand the idea pretty easily, I think. But the technical details obviously are a little bit more difficult to work with.
Yeah. So our next paper looks at code renewability for native software protection, and they focus on trying to prevent DRM. They try to prevent reverse engineering and asset extraction from software through a framework they present, which they call the Aspire Renewability Framework. So their threat model is people who have full control over the target software. They can read its instructions, its code. They can run it. They can debug it. They can use a custom operating system if they wanted to. Like, all the tools of the trade are considered. So they've coined this term called code renewability. I'll be honest, it's a bit annoying because they throw this term around a lot in the paper without defining exactly what it is until later on. And let me be clear, this is not an established term. This is a term that they basically invented. If you Google search it, there's nothing about it.
No, on the same thing, I didn't look this one up, but have you seen mate used in terms of man at the end?
Nope, I haven't seen that.
Okay, because that would, I mean, they explained that right at the start, and I understood, so I didn't look it up, but I had never seen it referred to that way either.
Yeah, it seems a little bit buzzwordy in a way.
Yeah, I mean, so at least mate definitely makes sense, and I get, man in the middle being a more common attack. This is a different situation. I get it. I've just not heard of it before. But sorry, go on.
It seems this idea of code renewability is basically dynamically rewriting the code that ultimately performs the same action, but it takes different routes and instructions to get there, to try to confuse the person reverse engineering.
Yeah, it may have protections that are kind of dynamically applied. So some of those code blocks might have protections in one case, but not when they're loaded in another. So that way, certain exploit mitigations might be present for some code, but not always.
Mm-hmm. So on page 5, figure 1, they actually have a little graph of how their, a general idea of how their protection works. I will say I feel like we've seen this before. I can't put my finger on it, but I'm almost certain we've covered a white paper that talked about dynamically rewriting code to obfuscate it. I think it was a chip actually that did it, wasn't it? It was I forget the name of the chip.
Oh, are you thinking of Morpheus?
I think that sounds familiar. I think it's that I'm thinking
of. Well, so Morpheus would randomize all the locations and stuff. I don't I mean, so the idea of replacing code like this isn't exactly new. The idea of having code blocks and having multiple blocks for the same piece of code that you can just swap in and out isn't completely new. Part of what's also new here is it's going to download this code off the internet. It's always it needs to always be connected to the internet. It's going to pull this out from somewhere online. It's not only doing this locally.
Which, if Microsoft taught us anything with the Xbox One, people absolutely don't want this. Because they tried to do the same thing with their DRM.
Yeah, people don't want to always be online, but I get why companies like it to always be online.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And the other thing I wanted to point out is, like, you know, that idea of dynamically rewriting code blocks not being new is kind of why them inventing this new term is kind of annoying too. But yeah, I just wanted to get
Well, it's a new term, so they are the originator of that term now, so gets them some credibility. Now, I don't think that's necessarily the case here. It looks like this is like university student, well, not necessarily students, but university professors or something. Like, it's out of several universities here. It looks like Ghent, London, so UK based group mostly. Or sorry, Ghent is not UK. I'm sorry. It's out of Belgium,
wow,
so EU based. Although UK isn't based in EU anymore, so nope, I'm just ruining everything.
UK and EU. I will say, like, what do you think overall of the idea of dynamically rewriting code like this? Do you think it'll actually work?
Yeah, it would absolutely be a pain to deal with. I mean, the whole thing is, like, it's always just about slowing people down, not about complete prevention. And when you have that in mind, like, will work, yeah, it'll slow you down. If it takes you an hour instead of 20 minutes, that's still a win. In terms of the DRM, like, it's always just about slowing the reverse engineering down.
Here's my problem. What's to stop you from just freezing the memory at a specific point in time and then just saving that and working with that and then just ignoring the rewrites entirely? Like, you still have obfuscation, but it's not being dynamically rewritten anymore because you just like save a snapshot of it and there's nothing they can do about it.
Well, so it seems like you won't have an entire snapshot at any one time. It'll have to load from the internet. So you won't necessarily have the entire binary at any one time to
but I mean, let's say,
freeze
like,
and work. I know kind of what you're getting at.
It, right? Like, that's what I'm getting at. Yeah. I just don't think it'll be that effective. And
I think it'll be a bit of a pain to deal with. I don't think it's necessarily going to stop everything. It's adding that little bit of extra work, and part of this is you've got to see it running to actually play with it and see how it responds. Maybe they do have something that we missed regarding trying to freeze it. Or just, if you have, as out of chat, if you had a deterministic environment, again, how does that kind of impact it? Those are definitely things that I don't think are addressed in this paper, but are reasonable attacks to bring up.
Yeah. And then there's also the replay attack that was mentioned in chat as well, by Nurupoga. I think I said that right. You could capture the internet traffic and replay it. Yeah, you could just, like...
Yeah, there are definitely ways they can defend against.
Yeah, they
those
could use,
also,
like, SSL or whatever, right? Like, they could use encrypted. Like, they could prevent, like, a man in the middle, but do they? Is the question, I guess.
Well, not even that. I mean, part of it, if we assume it's a non-deterministic environment, then it also kind of comes down to just having, like, a unique token, a time-based token, a signed request, actually that would be another thing, signing it, but I mean, it's a cat and mouse game, because generally it's not going to be completely defensible. Like, there's always going to be a way around, and there's always going to be some little step they can also take. That's kind of what it is. It's just that cat and mouse back and forth. And as in chat they mentioned, they're like adding your own certificate as a CA, so cert pinning, but then you can try and patch out the cert pinning, and you go back and forth with the lofty. So I think part of this is you really need to see that concrete system in place to see how they're trying to deal with it, or even if they try and deal with any of that. There are things they can do, and there are things we can do to attack it.
One kind of attack I thought of in my head while I was reading this. Now, this might be a stretch. I might be, taking a train to Crazy Town here, but I was wondering if you could actually leverage this to make it easier to reverse in the real world. Just because, like, what if you take screenshots of different swapped out blocks, or you can, and then you just compare them to find the common similarities between them to see what it's doing. Like, that is one thing I was thinking of too, is it might actually make it easier in a sense.
Code like this, though, you wouldn't necessarily just be adding instructions. You can change out instructions for semantically equivalent ones. So
I know. But I mean, like,
I don't know how well that would really work.
Between them could still yield results that you might not otherwise get as quickly,
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely potential. Like I said, I think really just need to see it running in a concrete situation to say what type of attacks could work, because this is one of those things that it's not trying to completely prevent any sort of access. It's just making the work harder to reverse engineer.
Yeah. Overall, I just wish the paper was a bit more clear. I think they are trying to upsell it and be purposely a bit obscure about how it works to try to make it seem more effective than it might be in practice. But
more complex too at times, like this graph.
Yeah, that graph, I think that is way more complex than it needs to be. It definitely seems like you're trying to sell it a little bit.
Diversified block database.
Diversified blockchains. But,
maybe this is also going to be blockchain based.
Maybe it's going to use blockchains on the server side. But yeah, no, like, I just wish they were a bit more clear about their terms and stuff. But like you said, it's hard to see directly from the paper how effective this will actually be. You'd have to see it in practice, really.
Yeah.
So we'll get into something that actually does scare me in practice, and that's memory tagging. MSRC actually did a security analysis of memory tagging. And for memory tagging, for people who don't know, you basically associate a tag to memory regions. Usually it's 4 bits wide. And, the pointers are encoded with that tag, usually in the upper 4 bits. And, when pointers are processed by the CPU, it checks the tag to see if it's valid. And if it isn't, it'll crash, or it'll throw an exception or whatever.
Yeah, when we say to make sure it's valid, it's like if you have a pointer to something, it's going to check the tag, and it's going to check where that pointer's, like the memory region that the pointer actually points to, and if they don't match. So if the pointer was overwritten because the tags are incorrect, the CPU itself enforces like, nope, you're not allowed to read that segment because your tag is wrong, or you don't have the right tag for it.
Yeah. So this idea of memory tagging has been kind of blowing up recently, since it was introduced in ARM V8, I want to say. We saw not too long ago that Google's actually trying to push for it as well. They're considering making it a foundational requirement for Android in the future. And the reason that, there's so much hype around it and why people really want to get it introduced from a defensive standpoint is it accomplishes making certain bug classes like use after freeze harder to exploit, where in the past they've typically been a lot harder to mitigate. Because addresses will all have different tags. So if you can leak an address, but you can't leak the tag, you're going to have issues when the CPU actually goes to check it, like you were saying. So it makes a lot of bug classes a lot harder to exploit. It basically kills uninitialized memory usage because it gives you initialization of memory for free, from what I've looked into it. And it also makes bugs easier to detect because things, fuzzers may hit things that might not crash and therefore they wouldn't be detected. But now they will crash due to, that memory check tag failing. So it's a scary mitigation from an exploitation standpoint. And not only was Google pushing for it, but now we're seeing Microsoft push for it as well. And when you get some of these bigger companies putting their weight behind a mitigation like this, it's pretty much inevitable that we're going to see it, I think.
Yeah, and I think especially Microsoft, we've seen them explore and experiment with mitigations before. So, like, they have a history of actually playing around with different mitigations. So, yeah, I can definitely see this coming about.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to highlight is they have a really nice table on page 11 that I'm going to scroll down to. And
I love how they broke everything down in terms of this.
Nice. Yeah.
Like, that, I think, makes this paper worth it, even if you ignore all the memory tagging aspect, just the way they've broken down exploits. I can't seem to speak today, but the way they've broken all the vulnerabilities down, mapping them to their primitives and all of that, really good just to read over and just, even reference for yourself. It's well done.
Yeah, it's got a full table of not only like common vulnerability classes, but also primitives that you get from exploiting those vulnerabilities. So, relative read, relative write, arbitrary write. It's got like primitives and bug classes. So this information, like, it's really nice where it's all grouped up together like this. I will say, like, this paper, it might be worth it for people out there in exploitation to start looking at this, get ahead of the curve, because like I said, I think it is inevitable that it's coming. I will ask how long do you think it'll be before we actually start seeing this in...
I really don't know. Before we start seeing it, before we start seeing it on like x86, when we see it in Windows. And I really don't know. I mean, because part of it is CPU enforced, so we need to see it coming off Intel, so generation or two, I'd want to say.
And then you also need OS support for it too. So.
The other thing is that we might just start seeing just more of a push towards ARM in general.
You think? We'll see the ARM desktop eventually?
I don't want to say that. But I mean, people are using mobiles more. People are using the specialized computers more frequently, and the desktop, the laptops, less frequently.
And it is
so that's more what I'm thinking of when I say more ARM rather than desktop ARM.
It is worth noting too that the new MacBooks are actually supposedly going to ARM as well, moving away from x86. So, that's another big company, Apple. They've had a lot in the game for ARM already because of iOS, but they're also pushing the MacBooks into ARM. So, yeah, it looks like at least some people are jumping ship from x86. And ARM has been kind of ahead of the game when it comes to mitigations. They've had pointer authentication for a while now that x86 still hasn't caught up to. And now we're starting to see the memory tagging stuff too. It seems like ARM's kind of pulling ahead in terms of security at the architecture level. So, but yeah, I think we'll start seeing this relatively soon, within the next couple of years. It does kind of scare me because
it's adding more work. I mean, and that's
not only that, but it really tunnels in on killing UAFs, and use after freeze are like my favorite bug class, man, and they're trying to kill them.
Well, it tunnels in on that. I mean, part of it though is if you have another, it feels like it could become kind of like ASLR, where you need another exploit to exploit your core issue. Either you're able to control what the tags are. I mean, it is limited in terms of how many bits you've got to create tags. So there is kind of the aspect of or at least a potential for brute force.
It's only 4 bits wide, so there is.
Yeah, in the case that they looked at it, actually. Space. If I want to say like the Cherry system used like only 2 bits for it. Although it was a little bit different in terms of how it was using tagging too. It wasn't using it to take sections. It was just like data versus code that it was tagging, and pointer versus executable. But so I don't know how many bits we'll actually see. But like it feels like it might just become like ASLR, where it's just, okay, you need another exploit you need some sort of leak, some sort of write to actually take advantage of it.
A good info leak, basically, is probably what you'd need. Like one that lets you get a lot of data. Just looking at the chat, if the app crashes, you guess the tag wrong and uses a new tag on restart. I mean, yeah, that's the thing. If we're talking about this in the context of kernel, this is a killer, because using the wrong tag could be fatal, and even if it's not, it's noisy. You'll get a warning in the kernel log or something like that.
Yeah, and I mean, brute force is always noisy too. I'll mention that.
Yeah. I mean, at the userland level, you're right, the app will crash, but crashing and restarting apps in userland is usually not a huge issue, and if it's only 4 bits, you will eventually get it. But like you said, it is noisy. But I think where it's going to be more of an issue is in kernel, where if it crashes on that exception, like totally crashes, fatal panic, That could be a killer. Yeah.
Yeah, brute force is definitely less usable when it comes to
real world.
Well, when it comes to the kernel.
Oh yeah, for sure. So yeah, I was saying like I like use after freeze. You know, they're probably my favorite bug class, and memory tagging is trying to kill it, and now these guys are also trying to kill it. Our last paper is called DangKiller, eliminating dangling pointers efficiently via implicit identifier. So we have this paper, and it actually works in tandem with memory tagging, which is kind of cool. It flows nicely with the last thing we just talked about. And they have a diagram of the general protection scheme. They have it on page 6. I think it's figure 4. They have it. I'm just scrolling down to it. Yeah, the diagram's a little bit confusing, but basically what happens is they assign a unique identifier to heap objects, and they keep a cache for each object ID of where potential dangling pointers are lurking. And then each time free is called, they check those logs for that object, and if there's any dangling pointers, they delay the free and recheck later. I will say I'm not entirely sure what makes this too different from mark and sweep. I was saying that before we started the episode because I was just a little bit confused. You were saying like they don't really do the sweep phase, but it's still pretty similar in how it works.
Yeah, so I mean, it seems like basically they create the pointer graph based on the actual allocations coming in, and then when you free it, they look that graph, they remove the vertex from it, not necessarily, actually, sorry, they remove the edge if necessary, but only if it has, basically only if nothing else is pointing to it. So that's kind of what Spectre mentioned with the delayed free. Similar even to reference counting, but they've got the full graph instead of just a count to see where everything's coming from. We mentioned this does mean that if you copy the pointer off onto the stack, it doesn't know about that. So there
is a common operation. So
yeah, or at least
that's a pretty big caveat.
That seemed to be one of the things that they did. And they also used memory tagging in here. Did you want to get into that, or?
I looked into like how they use memory tagging a little bit. It seems like they mostly used it as like an efficiency boost to like limit the overhead. I didn't entirely understand how well they were leveraging it, though. It was a bit weird how it was worded. I don't know if you got a bit more on that.
Yeah, so it seemed like they were basically using it to sort of the size of the data that's actually, like the more specific size that's actually in there. Okay. Like I said, this is a piece of metadata. They call a min-fat pointer. But they use the upper 6 bits to do that.
Yeah. Now,
that said, I guess actually we've forgotten to talk about the whole log compression, which is something different from any sort of mark and sweep, which is. And I actually can't say too much about it. I'll apologize for bringing it up and then being like, yeah, and I can't talk about it. But effectively, sorry, their compression though was effectively exactly that, trying to compress down its storage, like all this meta information that's storing. So the pointer graph and all of that, just adding compression onto that.
Trying to make the accesses faster and whatnot. They were saying
at least take less memory.
Yeah, they were saying like the memory overhead. They were trying to reduce.
The memory overhead seems to be kind of I won't necessarily say killer, but 143%. Overhead.
Well, I'd say killer is kind of
well. So it sounds like basically that's true with everything. With the other option too, with Dang San, it was 126%. So like this isn't something that's going to be used in the immediate future. Like we don't have that much free memory sitting around for all of the Electron applications to use an extra 100%.
Chrome does not allow this mitigation to exist.
I feel like this could be easier more in terms of detection though, perhaps. And yeah, maybe. Just mentioning performance overhead, it's still like up to like 11% performance overhead. So
which is decently significant if you're talking about something like kernel or anything low level.
Yeah, there's a lot of places where this just doesn't see. I don't think this is really going to see much adoption. That said, something that they don't do or that I found a little bit weird when they're talking about the memory overhead. They argue that, well, DangSan uses, like, its memory overhead is just the metadata, but DangKiller. So one of the things I don't think we mentioned is they also round all of the allocations out. They say the nearest power of 2. I'm assuming they actually mean like the next largest power of 2. Like if you, they're not going to allocate less room than you need. I would imagine. Yeah, so I assume that's what they're doing. But they do those larger allocations, which means just all of the memories kind of being expanded and potentially being expanded quite significantly. If you want to allocate 5 bytes, you're getting an 8 byte. Although at that point, it's already being expanded because that's just your minimums. But what they don't mention is how much extra memory DangKiller actually uses. They have this whole overhead, but they don't break it down. They just make the argument about how, well, DangSan is memory overhead of just metadata, but they've got this other thing that also explains it. But they don't break it down to show you how much metadata space DangKiller takes, and I find that a little bit suspicious.
And adding on to that, what I was going to say a bit earlier was one of their key goals set out with this paper is, obviously these kind of issues like use after freeze are made mostly redundant by garbage collectors. That's their purpose. Obviously in things like browsers, there are still UAFs. It's just bugs related to the GC, which are starting to die out a little bit now. But they say they're trying to compete with GCs in terms of performance. They're saying the performance overhead is often too high to be accepted in a lot of use cases, and that's what they try to tackle.
I don't feel like they did that very well then.
That's what I was
especially
say.
On the memory point.
Well, not even just on the memory point, even on the speed point. If you look at their actual performance benchmarks, which are important considering their goal, they seem kind of weird. They don't seem to actually compare against some other popular GCs or anything like that. They don't seem to compare against Mark and Sweep. Maybe I just missed that. Could be me. Could be a reader error, but I didn't see that anywhere really. I thought their performance benchmarks were a little lacking. They say
no, I didn't see that either.
Yeah, they say they use some benchmarks there with Spec CPU 2006 and stuff, but it seems it was kind of intentionally left a bit vague on the actual specifics. So, it's just a bit weird. I think it's worth keeping in mind. Maybe, like I said, it's totally possible I just missed it when I was reading through it, but
yeah, we've kind of sat here essentially discrediting it a bit, and I feel like there is it is a research paper that's come out. They've worked on this. There's a likely chance that we're misunderstanding something. So we're kind of hitting the end of the episode, but it definitely happens that we just misunderstand and, hate on something that actually is doing something cool. So I do just want to toss out the fact that's absolutely a possibility here again, but looking at the end results though, yeah, we do try and update the VOD and add something to the description if we need to correct something we've stated. But just basing on kind of the conclusion that's here, I'm not sure I'd agree with the lightweight aspect unless it's only comparing to some of the other things that do exactly the same thing.
Yeah, I was just going to say there, if you do, see any issues in something we're covering and want to make a correction, you can absolutely leave a comment on the VOD and we'll probably address it in the next episode or something like that. We're not perfect. It's possible we missed something, like you were saying. But that pretty much sums up all of our topics. The only thing we'll add on to the end of that is, talking about the VODs and stuff. We're live every Monday at the same time, 3 p.m. Eastern. Which is now, for those of you, it's now an hour closer than it used to be because, for a lot of people.
So that'll confuse most people, actually. The odd thing here between me and Spectre is I live somewhere that doesn't do DST, so the podcast, I used to do it at 2 p.m. my time, now it's at 1 p.m. my time, but for everybody else in the world that does DST, it's the same time.
Yeah, so the time hasn't changed, but It's just a bit weird where Z's on a different time zone. It confuses me sometimes. But yeah, you can check out our like past episodes and stuff like that on our YouTube channel. We also, there's the Twitch VODs. We have them on Spotify and Apple Podcasts as well. You can follow us on Twitter for any updates and check out our Discord if you want to, become part of that community. But yeah, that pretty much sums up this episode, and we will see you guys again next Monday.